Hi there, my name is Brett McFall. I'm here with Nathan Martin, who has literally decades of experience of helping young tennis players do their best, do better than their best, but actually it's about making sure that they're not making mistakes which could affect their career like forever. Nathan, thank you for joining me.
No problems, Brett. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think it's really important because there would be thousands of young tennis players out there who are hoping to maybe if they're not aiming for the stars, they want to improve their rankings. They want to have good tournaments. They want to play well. And they can go and practice more, right? They can get out in those courts and they can get a coach. They can get advice, tips, the whole bit. But what I found is you look at things a bit differently. What would you say is like the number one mistake that you would say young tennis players are making? I know maybe we're going to generalize, but let's hit this because I would think that the parents are watching this right now and wondering, what would you say is the big mistake that most young tennis players make in terms of becoming that great tennis player they want to be in the future?
Great question, Brett. I think the biggest issue most players and parents have, it's the structure. And what I mean by that is it's having an understanding where the player's at, and then obviously having that goal where they want to be, whether that's getting into college or potentially going pro one day, but really having the structure and having a plan to start with. And then that plan needs to have the option to be able to develop. A lot of players...
and I don't mean to interrupt, but let's say, okay, if it's me, what structure? That's my immediate question. What structure are you talking about? Because I can go and hit that ball again and again and again. Is that what I should be doing? Or do you say, well, hold on, Brett?
Yeah. So by structure, I mean like what happens on a weekly basis. So what happened then from that weekly basis, what happens on a daily basis, and understanding how much players should be playing tennis at a certain age, how much strength and conditioning they should be doing, what they should be doing for their warm-ups and their recovery, all those different things. So combining the whole holistic program together and creating that structure that is ideal for that athlete where they're at.
And then so that makes sense. It sounds like there's a way to do it and a way not to do it. What sort of structure might you be talking about? Give us some examples.
Okay, so an example would be, if you're a 12 or 13-year-old athlete that has the desire to improve their ranking, win more matches, and one day go professional, and they're doing full-time schooling as well at that stage. So they need to understand that their body's developing, which means that they need to be doing every day some exercises to support where their body's at. And they would include, doing some strength and stability work, making sure that they're doing enough recovery, so like stretching and foam rolling. And that's how we help them understand how to protect and guide their body through that process.
I got it, but let's say my 12-year-old is saying, Dad, I'm all good. I'm fine. I play, I run around at school all day. I play other games on the weekend. I don't need to stretch. What do you say?
Well, that's where the education comes in. And once we can educate players and parents around the importance of doing certain things, and some of these things, these training areas, they can become almost choresome for young players. But once we educate them on the benefits of doing them, and then just setting them up with some basic starting points to get moving, then generally they feel the benefit, they get the motivation, they want to keep doing it, then they want a little bit more. So that's what's important.
But Nathan, they're young, right? Their bodies are young, muscles are young. Why would you focus on the stretching? Because you think this is actually pretty important, and not just stretching, of course, but you actually take this as being pretty critical to the whole process.
Well, look, Brett, having 20 years experience now working with young players, we know at the developmental stages of their game, so when their bodies are physically changing, some of them can't keep up with the demands of what's happening on court because physically their bodies cannot handle it because their bodies are growing. It's almost like a young flower that we're trying to nurture and get into this big, strong, robust flower. If we don't do the right things to protect it and nurture it and make sure that it's growing in a safe and controlled environment, it's going to come unstuck and it's potentially not going to make it to where we know it can get to. And the same thing applies when we're dealing with young athletes. Now, we want to make sure that they are doing the right things at the right ages and stages in order to help them blossom down the track.
And then, so what would you say are some of the right things? Like, give me, say, a top three of the right things that athletes should be doing?
Okay, so from a physical perspective, every player should be preparing their body for exercise, so for tennis play or for their strength and conditioning session. So by that we mean some kind of a warm-up. And during the warm-up, what's really important is that they're not just going for a run. Anyone can do that. We need to make it specific for them and their age and the sport that they're playing. So there's a process that we educate players on, and I'll take you through it really quickly in regards to how we want them to warm up, which would be step one. And it's we want to increase the heart rate, so get them moving, get them skipping, get their coordination, what we call their coordination corridors, switched on and engaged. Then we want to activate certain parts of their body that we know, that we found from experience and also from scientific data, we know get highly used when they play. So activating certain parts of the body, doing a range of...
For example, Nathan, what kind of parts of the body?
So doing a range of targeting the shoulder girdle, so doing some band exercises and things like to work on the external rotation, getting the shoulder girdle open and getting everything switched on and engaged around the shoulders using resistance bands. Then we want to move down to the trunk, to the core, and we want to do some core exercises. And there's some exercises like what we call like a banded dead bug, which is laying down on the ground, and it's getting those deep core muscles switched on and engaged. And we want players to be able to have those muscles switched on when they're on court, so that their body gets used to working with those when they're moving around the court. And then the third area would be our hips, so getting our glutes firing. And there's a range of exercises we recommend for young players, like things like hip raises and using like mini bands. They pop around their ankles and they're going to move side to side using those bands. And it's a great way to get those muscles switched on. So that way we've got the hips, the core, and the shoulder girdle all switched on and activated. And then we move on to more specifics of the warm-up, which would be getting the racket in hand, doing some shadow swings, getting down into some deep lunge range positions, encouraging them to get into those positions before they jump on the court and play.
So what I think I hear you saying is, okay, there's the tennis side, but then it's about this, their abilities lasting them for a long time. So the muscles are conditioned. Maybe the nervous system is conditioned to perform over a whole day or maybe over a whole tournament, which might be a few days, without losing the play, right? The ability to really play.
Yeah, 100%. So, I think back to your point that out of the three key areas, definitely the first one, it's body management, really, like preparation and recovery. And these are areas that they're hard for young players to almost get their heads around. Like, how's this going to benefit me? Oh, it's a little bit boring. I've got to warm up. But what we found is that if we just incrementally increase what the players are doing in those spaces, so like what they're doing, like I mentioned, for their warm-up to prepare their body, and what they're doing after they play to help their body recover. So doing a range of tennis-specific stretching, so stretching out through the calves, stretching out through the front of the thighs, the quadriceps, getting into the glute muscles, and then also through the shoulder girdle, and helping the body then to recover. That's how we would target those areas in, issue number one would be that what we call that body management. And most young players, I spend quite a bit of time obviously working with young players and at tournaments, and I would say maybe 10% are getting close to doing it right. The other 90% are leaving the window right open for injury. And also for, their longevity in the game just isn't going to be there because they're
and
not.
So are you saying that sorry, Nathan, but are you saying you see this playing out? So when the tournaments are on, you can see young players starting to decline throughout the tournament, let's say, or just not performing the way you saw them, practice a few weeks back or something like that, like they're performing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and Brett, I've actually been at tournaments and I've seen players not doing the right things, and then 6 months later them contact us because they've been injured, or the motivation's not there, or players have taken them over because they were a really good young player, but now the players who have been doing the right things have overtaken them. And that's what we see, as common practice, which is why we just try to encourage so many people to get these things right.
So what I hear you saying, it's almost like there are tennis players and then there are athletes, and the athletes would do the full prep.
Yes.
So that when they hit the court, they're not just ready to play, they're over prepared, like they're completely ready, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah. And that builds confidence, right? Because a lot of players, the tennis, it's a very complex game. It's crazy, the complexity of it at all levels. And going back to your point there, if a player's doing the right things and they know they've listened to an expert and they go, hey, this I feel great, this works. That's how we lay our confidence. Like, players walk on court and they know, I've done everything right, I feel great. Back to your point, look, I feel like I'm ready to tackle this game. I feel like I'm a warrior. There's confidence in that. So that's the other benefit.
The mindset, right, of confidence. We all know it's everything, right? A confident person, let alone a confident tennis player, makes a big difference, right? It's just indisputable. A lot of parents might be thinking, how do I keep my son, my daughter motivated, right? Because what you're talking about sounds like work, and it is, because if you want to reach the end goal, we've got to put the work in. But what would you say to parents who maybe are worried their child might be falling behind or not reaching their potential, and they don't know how to motivate them, because they've got to get them out of bed, right? Come on, let's go and practice it. Like, so how do you handle that? What's your take on it?
Great question, because this is a question I get quite often. There's a couple of things we need to look at with this. Sometimes, unfortunately, with tennis, and I think with a lot of junior sport, is sometimes the motivation comes from external factors, and that can be parents or coaches or a guardian that's really wants the player to do well and to play.
Naturally, so first of all, right? So the parent,
And sometimes it's too much, and the player they just lose interest. They just feel too much pressure. So first of all, we need to make sure the enjoyment's there, and that comes from the environment. So if the parents have got it right and they're just making that space fun and enjoyable, and the same with the coaches, and every player is different. Every player likes to enjoyable means different things to different players. So working out what that is, that's step one. Then we need that intrinsic motivation as well, and that means more like what's coming from within the athlete. So we know from data that the players that are more watching live matches or watching replays, or they're keeping track on the professional scene, they're more motivated. They're looking at what they want to be, and that's what's driving them to be there. So getting players to keep up to date with what's going on in the professional space, watching matches or watching replays is extremely critical. Now, I would say the biggest factor in order to drive motivation, though, it's just education and awareness. And education isn't a word that a lot of young players like to hear. So it's just about spreading some awareness for them and doing it in specific ways that are applicable to the age group that you're dealing with, and making them aware of why it's important to look after their body and what the professional players do, and explaining that from experience, and explaining to them from experience, like, if you can do this like them, when you're not going to do it like them because you're a child, like, we want to create the habits now, and then that generally gives them the motivation to keep wanting it and to keep doing it.
Maybe give me an example of how I could be a good parent then. We'll put it in my perspective. What is the best way forward for me as a parent to try and help my child stay motivated on the court? And I know it's hard, different children, different attitudes, different parents. What's something consistent that you see? Here's what you should do as a parent, a method, a concept, a principle.
Yep. There's a couple of key things. One, it's to have really good communication with the athlete, because it is a complex sport. So we go back to the enjoyment factor. We need to say, hey, are you enjoying your coaching lessons and your squads? And what do you think we can be doing better in that space? And generally they're going to say, I love my coach, but some of the kids in there, blah, 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 blah. So it's just opening up that communication. It's important at a young age to get that going on, because the parent then will get a better understanding of what works for the player and what could be better. I I think also, like we mentioned before about that structure, as soon as an athlete understands what they've got to do and how it's going to benefit them, they will be more inclined to stick to that, and they'll feel the improvements, and the motivation will be there. So the parent won't have to be saying, hey, come on, Charlie, you got to get out of bed and get there. They go, no, this is custom designed for me, and I understand my plan. And so the motivation comes from that. Everyone knows what's happening on a daily basis, and they can keep going. And then the third point would be it's basically they want to feel results, whether that's their ranking improves or they're winning matches. So they need to be doing work in that space as well. And the parents need to understand their role in tournament play as well.
And what is their role in tournament play? Ideally, that is.
Ideally, yeah. Get your child, help them get organised with their hydration and their nutrition. So make sure they've got their water and their sports drinks and their healthy food for match day. Help them, guide them through preparing their bodies, so doing their exercises in the morning, and get them to the tournament. And basically, when they get to the tournament, it's just supporting them there. It's not being overly critical. It's just basically supporting them. And a big thing is going through the process with the young player. And this is one thing that I even do. I work with some of the top juniors around the world, and I still have the same conversation with them as their trainer. How do you want me to speak to you when you're playing? What works best for you? Let's navigate through that together. And when do you want me to start talking to you and trying to help you? Some players don't want much. Some players want you to say something all the time. So knowing the parent's boundary in that space, a lot of parents get frustrated because they're trying to encourage their child, but the child might necessarily respond well to it. So it's knowing your boundaries during match play as well.
That's really interesting. It's more consultative. That's what it feels like. You are in that parent role. I think you're suggesting, consult your child. Where are we on the plan? Where are we going to? And are you happy? What else can we do to help you?
Yeah.
Like that's what I hear you saying. And then on the day, it's all off court. It's off court stuff. Right? Just let the child play the game, and you're there to support, not to coach, right? Because it's not your role.
100%, exactly. Right on point. Right on point.
So then a lot of parents that might be watching this will be worried about injuries. Like, they know that an injury could take them out of their sport for weeks, if not months. What advice do you have for them in terms of trying to help in that area to prevent?
Yep. Very good question, mate, because this is an area where a lot of players do lose time in their development. And we look at their players' development through different stages. Like when a player's like up to the age of 10 years old, you want it to be the training not to be overly structured and really detailed. You want kids just to feel like they're doing some off-court training, so some strength and conditioning training, but it's fun and it's working on their coordination, etc. And then apart from that, as the athlete gets a little bit older, we want to make sure that we're ticking the right boxes in regards to where their development's at. So before I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment about some exercises and things that people can do. So we've got some takeaways for people. But what's really important to understand is that you can have a 12-year-old athlete that looks like a 15-year-old athlete. Their physical maturity has sprouted what we call sprouted really young. And then you could have a 15-year-old athlete that physically looks more like a 12-year-old athlete. And you're not going to train each athlete the same. Okay, so it's why people need to get advice and understand at the physical maturity development stage on what they need to be doing, because sometimes kids go into big groups and they'll say, okay, everyone here is 15, you're going to be lifting weights. And you can have someone who, yes, they're almost built like an adult. They're going to be okay with it. But if you've got someone that's not, they're going to get themselves in trouble. That's important that people understand that. And that's why they need to get advice and see where their child's at. And that comes back to doing fitness testing, looking at the athlete playing, looking at their physical maturity.
So it's not about a gut feel as in, I think I know what my child needs. It actually is more about mechanics, if I understand it correctly. It's about their physical shape, not their age. That's what I hear. And so every height difference could maybe make a training difference. Is that correct?
Definitely. So Brett, we look at 3 different areas when we set programming, or we set players up with some training structure. We look at the chronological age, so how old they are in birth years, could be 12 years old. We look at the physical maturity. So, yep, they look like a 12-year-old, that their height, their muscle development, etc., is typical of a 12-year-old. And then we look at their training experience. So if someone comes to me and they present, they're 12 years old, they look like a 12-year-old, and they've been doing some work with a trainer at school for 2 years, I know, okay, I know where the athlete's at. I know what programming they should be getting. What typically happens, though, is players will go and do something that their 15-year-old brother or sister are doing that's not really applicable to them, and they're open to injury if that happens.
So it's very much, you're very, very clear then on it better be suitable, for their body shape, their body height.
Yeah. And there's a way that we work that out with people as well. And once we know what someone's doing in a given week, so we've looked at what we call their weekly schedule, their weekly structure. Then we look at where they are at physically with their development, and we combine those 2 areas together, and we go, okay, this is what the reality of the player. That's basically their reality. Those two areas combined. Physically, this is where they're at, and this is what they're doing with their tennis practice and their schooling and everything. And from there, we go, okay, we know what we've got to work with. We know where they want to go. How do we set that foundation structure for them?
And I would suggest, and you might confirm, most parents just don't know what is required. Unless they've been trained at a high level themselves or educated at a high level, they just don't know, and they could actually be harming their child's abilities or their plans for the future.
Happens all the time. Yeah, happens all the time. Yeah, and if people look at a lot of our content that we put out there, it's a lot of it's focused on educating parents and young players on what to do and when to do it and how to do it, etc.
But what to do and when to do it, to me, that's one of the key things I think you've said, because the body's growing. The body is growing. And the wrong timing there. And I guess that comes down to probably what I talk about next is that, parents, they want to see results. So does the player. But you might have parents who are thinking, okay, we are, our child is training hard. They're becoming an athlete. How do we ensure results, or how do we actually then regulate the expectations of parents for results too? What do you say to that?
Well, getting results, I think it comes down to a number of factors. If I have to give you, and I'll give you like probably what I feel is the most impactful answer, and then I'll work my way down a little bit. So, having worked in that professional space and now working in that high-end junior space as well, so working with some of the best juniors in the world, the one thing that the pros and these top juniors have in common, it's an uncanny ability to compete. So I'm working closely with a guy. He's our best junior in Australia by a long way. He's only a young guy, and he's still not doing a lot. There's a lot of things that we need to be doing a lot better with him, but he needs to be willing to take the advice and be able to do it. We can't force him to do these things. But his ability to compete, once you get him into the arena, onto the court, he becomes another player. He becomes like another beast. So that competitiveness has to be there. And we need to motivate players to enjoy competing. And we need to set expectations around competing. So we need to say, hey, when you go onto court, we need you to feel like you're going to give it everything that you've got. That is step one. Can you commit to that? And they go, yep. And what does that mean to the player? Because for some players, it might be, I'm going to chase every ball down. I'm going to serve as hard as I can. So it's navigating through what does competing mean to them. Doesn't matter what you do prior to that point. You could have the fittest, the smartest, and the most technical player. But if they can't use that to compete at a high level, they're going to get beaten by someone who's down here in those other areas, because competing and really getting on the court and attacking it and fighting to that last ball is step number one. So, and giving people strategies in order, to pass on to their players to do that, it's critical.
So pause right there. I think this is brilliant, by the way. You're talking about that competitive spirit, which can be grown. I think you're suggesting, Brett,
Yes,
it can be grown,
skill.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting. It isn't just does he or she have it or don't they have it. It is about them actually then growing into having that spirit, and maybe they turn it on at certain times, which is what I think you're saying that young player can do. So this is a quality that can be learned. It's very interesting. What else you got?
Well, Brett, I'll tell you where that starts. Okay, so I cannot expect, and I pass this on to parents and players all the time, I cannot expect a young player to play tennis at, say, compete mentally and physically and technically at a level at, say, 8 out of 10. If you can play at an 8 out of 10, you're going to win a lot of matches. A 9 and 10 out of 10, you might play, if you're playing 50 matches a year, you might play 3 to 5 at a 9 or 10. Okay, so it doesn't happen often. If we can get players to generally get up and hit an 8 quite frequently, though, they're going to win most matches by doing that. And what I mean by that is it's competing at a high intensity. It's having the technical ability to be able to execute, the right shots at the right time. It's having a high tennis IQ, which means that you're teachable. Now, all those things, when people understand how we get those 3 areas firing, a light bulb goes off for them. I'm going to tell you what it is. It happens in practice. If we look at where most players spend their time, it's on the training court. It's practicing with the coaches or in squads. So what we do most often as tennis players, it's going to have an impact on how we play in matches. So if players are getting to practice and they're training at a 5 and they're consistently training at a 5, so they're not listening as well as they could, they're not running and playing with a high physical intensity, and technically they're not really absorbing a lot of the information they're getting, we cannot expect them then to go and play tournaments and play at an 8 out of 10. And they can't expect themselves to do that either. So then what happens is these players are practicing at a 5, they play at a 5, and they get frustrated because they can't get to an 8. And it's a light bulb moment when we get that through to parents and players, all of a sudden they turn up to practice with a new vigor, a new higher level of teachability, and then that creates the habit that then flows into the practice, into matches.
It's fascinating. And you literally said nothing about tennis there.
No.
What I pick up, right, is the attitude. It's really mindset. That our brains are so powerful, right? It's so powerful, and we've got to train our young players to use their brain to become their best friend, right? Because if I'm not wrong, sometimes that brain can become their worst enemy, and right at times when they don't need it to be.
Yep, definitely. And there's been players that we've worked with, and physically they've just been in great shape, Brett, like great shape, like just like, wow, this person's like, 9 out of 10. And then we watch them play and they're competing at a 5. So we know then, that they just need to flick that switch. They need to approach the match with the same intensity that they are with the practice. But practice it's if they're doing that, most players will train, young players will train 3 to 5 times a week for an hour to 2 hours at a time. So that's roughly, say, at the higher end, 10 hours a week. And they might play a match on average every second or third weekend. So when we add the time up and break it down in a percentage, it's probably a tenth of their time is spent playing matches, where 90% of the time is spent practicing for matches. So if we can get that practice right and get it really organized and structured, and, if physically we need to get them to be able to compete and to be able to play with high intensity on the practice court. And that's where we come into play. And then encouraging them to get there with the right attitude and compete and play with the right intensities is how we combine it together.
I tell you what I wouldn't like. I wouldn't like my child to be competing against a child that you've trained. That's what I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And we
Yeah,
hear
I
that
feel like,
often.
yeah, I feel like you would have covered so many areas that child that you've trained is turning up mentally ready, physically ready. And then that other part, which is that competitive spirit, is alive and well, and there's enjoyment coming from it, right? And it's a powerful combination.
So, Brett, players find it hard, though, when they're competing, if they're not physically able to compete up at around that 8 out of 10 level, most players will be able to get themselves there, but the players that can stay up there for the majority of the match, they're going to, in that junior space, they just wear so many people down. And people think, oh, it's they mentally just lost it, and they couldn't keep it together. There's brackets flying around the court. There's a lot of verbal things going on. But generally what we find happen is the player that's real physically able and strong and robust, that they generally are the ones that mentally hang in there the longest, because as soon as the body starts to break down, frustration kicks in, and some young players don't realize that. So it's getting them in practice with their coaches and in their squads to work at that high intensity. And then when they're doing their work with us, we get the ability and the opportunity, and this might sound a little bit sadistic, but we get the opportunity to push them up and beyond the range, the physical range that they're going to work at in practice and in matches. So that way we equip them with the ability to go, hey, yeah, this is tough and it's hot and I've been out here for 2 hours, but the work I've done with the guys at Tennis Fitness, this has pushed me above and beyond this. So I'm confident in this space. They look down the other end of the court and they're looking at someone that's like, I just want to get off here. I'm just going to tank this match.
Game over. It's game over at that point, right? It's not the physical stuff anymore. Now it's the mental side kicking in to push. It's very impressive.
Yeah, because of the physical work you've done.
Yeah, exactly. Everything's all in line, right? Everything's all in line. You're turning up confident because you've trained. And so the mindset helps the physical set, and it's there's no luck involved in this. That's what it feels like. There's no luck. It's consistency.
That's such a good way to look at it.
That
is such a good way to look at it. And I agree with that 100%. We want to have the least amount of luck involved, the better for the athletes we work with, because the hard work and doing the right things. It's not always just about hard work. It's doing the right things. That's what.
Let me ask you this. Very good, thank you. Let me ask you this, and we'll get off the topic of your advice now. What makes you tick? Like why are you doing this? There could be many things you could do, Nathan. No doubt your abilities could apply to many different fields. Why do you choose this?
The complexity I love, and what I mean by that is when we look at tennis, technically extremely challenging sport. There's not many other sports where technically you have to be able to, there's multiple different shots, forehand, backhand, serve, volleys. And within those things, there's different ways, depending on where the ball is, to hit those shots. So there's the technical aspect. Then there's the competitive aspect. So we look at your ability to compete, which I'd love. Trying to help people navigate through that space is what that means to them. How do I do it really well for me and my personality? Then there's the strategy behind it as well. Like, I'm playing someone. This is how they like to play. What are their weaknesses? What are my strengths? How am I going to break this match down? And that's where I love connecting with coaches and learning from them as well. And then what we do, it's the physical aspect. And within what we do, there's many different layers as well. So we need to look at, people's ability to have a high level of endurance, their speed and agility, their core strength, their power endurance. Tennis is categorized as a power endurance sport. Their recovery and their body preparation. So from what we do, it's extremely complex compared to a lot of other sports, because we've got no deadline. There's no cutoff on a tennis court. No. A match won't finish at 9:05. A match will just keep going until there's a winner. So it's the complexity of it is really what drives me, and I just feel like I'm just going to keep learning and learning.
Yeah, I can feel it too, right? So you're like a scientist to me. You're like a scientist who's just looking at this little chart going, with every person you would coach. It's like, where does this person rate on this chart? And I can know their strengths and weaknesses, and then we can always build up the weaknesses, right? And I'm talking, physically you've talked about, but also mentally too. It's very impressive. I think you've given very generously here today. Thank you very much indeed. And look, near this video, there'll be a button where people can get in contact with you. I recommend they should, for their sake, but also their child's sake, to have someone like you on their team. Super impressive. Nathan, thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Brett. No problem.
Awesome work.